we have come together to celebrate Joseph Eggleston's life and to mourn his death. Ecclesiastes tells us that there is a time to be born and a time to die. A problem for me with that is that only rarely does our dying come at the right time, whatever that right time is. In Dr. Eggleston's death, I am reminded again that we cannot take time for granted. It is difficult to believe that one day the sun will rise, the birds will sing, the world will continue, and we will not be a part of it. But as difficult as it is to believe, that is fact. It would be my interpretation that this is what the psalmist was trying to communicate to us when he wrote these words: "We flourish and grow in the morning, we fade and wither in the evening. Oh, teach us to number our days, that we may attain a heart of wisdom." Those of us who occasionally experience the death of a patient in our professional lives have singular difficulty when death reaches its cold and unwelcome hand into our circle of friends and intimates. Joe meant something very special to every one of us, and that is why we are here this afternoon. Some of his friends and some of his professional colleagues will give direction to our thoughts now as to some of their reasons to be thankful for Joe's time among us.
Sylvia, family members, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to speak about Joe Eggleston as I knew him and the contributions he made to the Department of Pathology. Joe's years as an undergraduate at Duke University and as a medical student here revealed the promise that was to be amply fulfilled in his professional life. After graduating MD in 1962, he interned in medicine on the Osler service and followed this with 2 years of military duty in the Air Force. He returned here in 1965 for training in pathology, and apart from a year at Memorial Hospital in New York, spent his entire professional career in the Department of Pathology. It was my good fortune to have known him for all of this time, and his first faculty position as assistant professor in 1969 was one of the earliest appointments made during my time as director of the department. Very early in his training, he decided that surgical pathology was his forte, and he was very soon plunged into the thick of this when the late Bill Shelley left in 1970, and Joe and Darrell Carter, two very young men, were left to run an extremely busy service. They did this with great distinction, and when Darrell left for Yale, the entire responsibility was Joe's. He very quickly recruited a series of bright young people, often his own trainees, and built up what was one of the strongest surgical pathology divisions in the country. Year after year, he and his staff gave 2 of our senior residents specialized training in surgical pathology, and many of these are now establishing or have established themselves as fine academic surgical pathologists up and down the country. Very early on, he saw the importance of immunologic techniques in routine service pathology, and in collaboration with the Department of Oncology, set up a fellowship program to develop these methods. The result was the creation of a highly successful immunohistologic laboratory, which today is one of the strong points of the department. His contributions to surgical pathology were nationally recognized, and at the time of his death, he was president-elect of the Arthur Purdy Stout Society, the premier surgical pathology society in the country. Joe was not only a great trainer of surgical pathologists, but a fine teacher of medical students. I know this particularly well because for the last 15 years, he and I taught in the same group in the pathology course. He gave beautifully prepared and clearly delivered lectures in which he was able to draw from his own vast experience, and his sessions with small groups of students were models for the younger faculty members. He was firm with students, never tried to ingratiate himself with them, yet at the same time he was scrupulously fair and could see merit in some of the more unconventional students when it often eluded others, including myself. He was the author of many original papers and co-author of 2 books. His publications were based mainly on surgical pathology material, and apart from showing his great knowledge and insight, revealed several other of his characteristics. First among these was his generosity, and this was shown by his unfailing habit of allowing his younger co-workers to be the first authors and to take the major credit for the work. Second was his great ability to work effectively with people so that surgeons, oncologists, and others from different specialties frequently participated in the publications. And I'm sure that Drs. Cameron and Abeloff will refer to this when they speak. His contributions to the department were truly enormous, and apart from what I have mentioned, he served on numerous departmental committees. His excellent judgment was of great value, and he was never afraid of taking an unpopular stance and defending his views vigorously and eloquently. Others will speak of his medical school and university-wide interests. Suffice it to say that he was never parochial and gave freely of his time and wisdom in many different areas. I knew Joe better than I knew most of the faculty because apart from our frequent meetings over professional matters, I made a point over the last few years of going up to his office on a regular basis and talking to him on matters completely unrelated to medicine. During these conversations, I was struck by his tremendous knowledge of diverse subjects. We often disagreed, particularly when political matters were discussed, and he could argue with such skill that you became convinced, at least for the time being, that his views were invariably correct. On the lighter side, he educated me about American football, which up to that time I had regarded, and still do, as a perversion of rugby football. He was also my tutor on basketball. At the end of the Duke-Georgetown game on Sunday, my first thoughts were how delighted Joe would have been with the outcome, and how he would have enjoyed relating the finer points of the game to me when we next met. It was also during these chats that I came to appreciate all the more his great courage. I never once heard him complain or feel sorry for himself, and the way in which he handled his illness was a wonderful lesson to us all in how to deal with adversity. As you know, he continued to work right up to the end and never gave in to his illness. When we were small children in England, we were brought up on tales of heroism, invariably, of course, British heroism, and one of these was Captain Scott's expedition to the South Pole in 1911. You'll recall that Scott was narrowly beaten to the pole by the Norwegians, and how he and all his men perished on the way back. In tribute to them, a wooden monument was erected near the anchorage of the ship that took them to the Antarctic, and on it were written the splendid words, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." These, I feel, would serve as a fitting epitaph for the life of Joe Eggleston, colleague and friend.
Sylvia, members of the family, and many of the friends of Joe. In any large referral hospital such as ours, in my mind, without question, the single most important doctor, the most important physician is the surgical pathologist. The surgeons, of course, are completely dependent upon the surgical pathologist for all of their important decisions. The surgeon really doesn't decide whether to remove a lung or a leg for a tumor. The surgical pathologist makes those difficult decisions. But in addition to the surgeons, the internists, the pediatricians, the oncologists, they all have to make their way to the surgical pathologist for the decisions that ultimately determine patient care. And therefore, I think the quality of care of an institution such as ours depends more on the surgical pathologist than any other single physician in the institution. We've been fortunate over the past 20 years to have Joe making those decisions. The discipline of surgical pathology started here at Hopkins almost 100 years ago, and the institution has been blessed with outstanding ones. Joe really stood out amongst the best. He began his career, as Heppy mentioned, as a medical intern on the Osler service before his training in pathology. I was a surgical intern that same year, and it was clear to all of us in the Department of Surgery on the house staff that Joe was an outstanding clinician, an excellent doctor. I think it was this clinical background, aided by his great diagnostic skills as a pathologist, that made him such an outstanding surgical pathologist. He understood the clinical circumstances, and this allowed him to influence patient care far beyond just recognizing a tumor under the microscope. I'm sure Joe made mistakes during the past 20 years, but I certainly wasn't aware of any. And all of us in the institution had absolute and complete confidence in his judgment. Joe and I were also medical school classmates and friends for almost 31 years. He was a marvelous friend with a very pleasant but sharp sense of humor, who was at ease with everyone and in every situation. We had a very congenial, warm, and comfortable relationship, but being classmates, we were also somewhat competitive. The operating rooms and Joe's labs, of course, were adjacent, and so I, as well as the rest of the surgeons, had virtually daily contact with them. When I brought a frozen section or an outside slide into him, which was often, our relationship changed. The conversation always started with, "What do you have, Johnny?" The Johnny was to connote affection, but more importantly, Joe was telling me he was in charge, he was the boss, he would be making the decision, and there was no competition here. He was supremely confident in his ability as a surgical pathologist, and we all benefited greatly from his talent. The most remarkable strengths of Joe's personality, however, only became slowly evident to me over the past 7 years of his life. Although he openly and freely was willing to discuss his illness and its progression, if asked, I never once saw him upset, never once heard him complain, never once heard him suggest that he hadn't quite gotten a full share. I'd been out of town and returned in early January when I heard, as soon as I got into the hospital, that Joe had been operated upon again. That obviously had to mean awful news, and it was immediately evident in the hospital that everyone was very upset and depressed. as I started making rounds that first day back in the hospital, I found myself putting off going by to see Joe because I was concerned about what I was to say. I was trying to think of what I could possibly do or say to cheer him up, to make him forget for just a minute. Finally, I'd done all my chores. I couldn't put it off any longer, so I went, knocked on his door, and went into his room. He was in bed, obviously very ill, receiving oxygen. But as soon as I came in, there was a big smile on his face, and as usual, Johnny greeted. Apparently, he recognized immediately how badly I felt, as he must have recognized that in everybody who came in his room. Because before I realized it, he was trying to cheer me up. It was a complete role reversal. He described his operation and the events of the last couple of weeks in great detail and with amazing humor, taking every opportunity to poke fun at the surgeons and the discipline of surgery whenever he could. He had a remarkable ability, which I think he had developed over the past 7 years with obviously the great support and help of his family and others, to be totally objective, to accept, and had achieved the equanimitas that all surgeons strive for, but which Joe obviously had achieved. I'd like to read just one line from Osler's address, Equanimitas, that interestingly was delivered almost to the day 100 years ago. It has been said that in patience you shall win your souls. And what is this patience but an equanimity which enables you to rise superior to the trials of life? For 31 years, Joe was a marvelous friend to many of us in this community. For 20 years, he served the institution in an exemplary fashion as our surgical pathologist. But for the past 7 years, we learned far more from Joe about how to prioritize, how to put our professional goals and ambitions into proper perspective, and how to live our lives.
Sylvia, family members, friends of Joe. Joe represented in his life what this place was really meant to be by its founders. A place which attracts the best physicians in order to give outstanding care to patients. A place where education of young people in medicine takes place through inspiring teachers. A place which gives opportunity for inquiring and prepared minds to contribute to the understanding of the cause and treatment of human disease. We look for people who can do that. Joe epitomized that, and he leaves his own legacy along with many others. He did those three things exceedingly well. Of course, he was one of the young people here at one point, and perhaps that's one of the reasons he understood it so well. But he learned here, and then he taught here, he inquired here, and he gave patient care here. And he did it with the Hopkins touch. He was a real expert in surgical pathology, as Heppy and John have noted. And that really does translate into making difficult judgments based on experience and knowledge, which can make the difference between ease of mind and dread, between one treatment, no treatment, or another treatment for patients and families. Let me tell you a personal story, I'm sure among many that could be told of similar nature. How important what Joe did well, he did, and to underline what John had said. I have friends, and they had a young adult son. And he was told that he had carcinoma. And the family came to me upset. I was upset. I knew the young man well. He was a good friend of my children. And for a number of reasons, however, when they told me the diagnosis, location, etc., I had considerable doubt. I talked to a few other people and then suggested them at a minimum that the pathology sides be reviewed. I called Joe, and he agreed to do so. And he called me back, and he said, this isn't carcinoma. This is a perfectly benign disease. He didn't say that with any sense of triumph about the fact that he was right, the other pathologist was wrong, or anything like that. What he did say to me is there should be a very happy young man and family in town today, because I don't think this is carcinoma at all. A lot of people, you know, might have looked at that as, gee, I'm better than someone, but he really looked at what he said and what he felt and what he believed meant to people. And that is a very, very important attribute. I might add that the young man, Joe, must have been right. That's about 7 years ago, and no other treatment has been given since then. As a teacher, I've been told by everyone he was an inspirer of young people. And they're found, as noted earlier, the newest generation of experts trained by Joe here and in other hospitals and other medical schools, teaching and, of course, inquiring after the cause and treatment of the disease. Joe really did it all in our terms here at Hopkins over a number of years. Most of all, of course, he was a friend and colleague to all that were here, and an inspiration to us all in how he handled his disease, and of course, a devoted husband and father. Sylvia, let me thank you and your family for sharing Joe with us, and of course, thank you for continuing to be a part of the larger Hopkins family.
At the time that this memorial tribute was being planned, we did everything possible to schedule it in a way that all of the persons who should and could participate could be here. But unfortunately, Dean Ross was one person who just simply could not make it because of prior commitments. In lieu of being here, therefore, he has asked me to read a brief message, which is as follows. I have known Joe since his medical student days and watched with pleasure his growing record of achievement in pathology. On the national scene, he became recognized as the expert in the pathology of lung cancer. At Johns Hopkins, he was known as a gifted and respected teacher, faculty leader, and contributor to the solution of institutional problems. Most remarkable was the way Joe dealt with his illness during these last few years. His courageous but rational approach to the inevitable progression of his cancer was a magnificent testimony to his character and a lesson to all who care for patients with a fatal illness. We all miss Joe, but are grateful for the better understanding of ourselves which came from knowing him.
Sylvia, family members and friends of Joe Eggleston. In thinking back over the past 18 years, I got to know Joe in a number of different ways. As a professional colleague with shared interests in clinical and research aspects of pathology and oncology, as a friend, and as a patient. As I pondered these different relationships, I realized that in each capacity, Joe had been my teacher. From the first day I came back to Hopkins as a faculty member in the early 70s, one of the most pleasurable parts of my day was visiting the surgical pathology labs to discuss a case with Joe Eggleston. His knowledge of pathology, and it has been mentioned, medicine, he not infrequently reminded me of his Osler house officer days in internal medicine, but that was a replacement for Johnny. His analytical abilities and his refreshing appreciation of the limits of the diagnostic abilities of both pathologists and clinicians provided a tremendous resource to me and my colleagues in the Oncology Center. I had the further privilege of working with Joe in a number of different research projects where he truly provided the ideas and the inspiration for these specific projects. He was a skeptic and certainly did not jump on the bandwagon of popular theories. The crispness of his thinking and the eloquence with which he expressed his opinions made very much less painful the fact that he was disagreeing with me or bursting the bubble of my sometimes naive enthusiasm. As Joe and I got to know each other better over the years, my visits to surgical pathology were often prolonged, much to the chagrin of our residents and fellows, by catching up on the accomplishments of our wives and daughters, our plans for vacations, our thoughts on current political issues. We also seldom agreed on politics, but always enjoyed the disagreements. I came away from these meetings with a sense of pleasure and enrichment. Then, while I was at a meeting in Tucson in March 1981, I remember the moment all too well, I was informed that Joe had had a diagnosis of lung cancer. Of course, I was shaken, and before I could get in touch with Joe, he called me, calmly described the clinical and pathologic findings of his case with his usual precision, came to see me, and outlined his plans with remarkable clarity of thought and courage. Throughout his entire illness, Joe maintained that clarity of thought and courage, as well as his incredible sense of humor. And as much as I had learned from him previously as a professional colleague and friend, I learned even more from him as one of his doctors. My only regret about my personal relationship with Joe is the fact that I didn't ask him to tape several of our conversations at key decision-making points in the course of his illness. As I mentioned previously, Joe was a skeptic regarding popular new advances in cancer therapy and diagnosis. However, he approached his own cancer with a determination to avail himself of all therapeutic opportunities as long as he could continue as a devoted husband and father and as a productive director of surgical pathology. He would reject those diagnostic and therapeutic approaches that were not likely to allow him to accomplish these goals and that would adversely impact on the high performance standards he set for himself. Nothing was going to interfere with holidays with the family and other special occasions. His teaching assignments, which he relished and did so well, were not to be disturbed. I have fond memories of doing battle with Joe in CPCs in this very hall at several times during the course of the past 8 years. In fact, Joe actually insisted in participating in a clinical symposium on lung cancer just several weeks after he was diagnosed as having the very same diagnosis, and he delivered an absolutely eloquent address regarding lung cancer. Some have written about the difficulties that physicians have in receiving health care for serious illnesses in their own hospital. Joe Eggleston's philosophy of living and his determination to remain a productive human being did not lend themselves to that sort of despair. Towards the end of his illness, when it was apparent to Joe that he would not bounce back, as he remarkably did on so many occasions during the past 8 years, and at a time when many of us who were his physicians were offering a wide range of therapeutic options, many of which were really measures of desperation, Joe once again incisively sorted out the approaches that were consistent with his philosophy of life and eloquently stated how we as his physicians could help him to deal with the last days of his illness. As I mentioned, I really wish I had some of these conversations on tape, so others could have shared in what Joe once again was able to teach me, this time not about the pathology of tumors or research techniques, but about life. I miss Joe as we all do. However, his impact on me as a colleague, as a friend, and above all as a teacher will not be diminished.
I was pleased to be asked to take part in this tribute to Dr. Eggleston. I hope I can speak not only for myself, but as a representative of many residents and medical students who benefited from Dr. Eggleston's instruction and guidance over the past years. It's difficult to enumerate the ways in which he educated us. His intellect and his expertise and fund of knowledge were a tremendous resource for us all, but what we learned from him went far beyond the interpretation of tissue sections. Through his example, we learned logical approaches to complicated problems. We learned to be careful and compulsive, as well as decisive. We learned how to work at being the best physicians and surgical pathologists we could possibly be. If the past few months are any indication of the future, we will continue to learn from his example. When previously encountered problems present again, well-learned lessons that he taught us in the past are recalled. When new difficult situations arise, we sit back for a moment and think, what would Dr. Eggleston do? And then we can proceed. He was greatly appreciated by us all, and he is greatly missed.
It was only in sitting here listening to others that a memory came back to me, one that I thought I had forgotten, but there it was in my mind, and all I needed to hear was some of what you have said to bring that back. And the memory goes back to 1977, when I had surgery on my vocal cords, and there was real question whether I would ever be able to speak publicly again. And that not only was a threat, it also was an economic disaster waiting to be born, because I earned my living by using my voice. I insisted on a second opinion, and when I was given that second opinion that all was clear once the growth had been removed, I said, who was the pathologist? And they said, it was Joe Eggleston. Why does that matter? I said, I believe that I am clear of anything, because if Joe says I'm all right, I'm all right. I want to direct a word through the camera to Elizabeth and Anne and Elaine. We wish you were here, and I know you would want to be here. And when you see this tape, I want you to have at least this word from me, that whatever it is that you're doing something that is important, that you need to be doing, that you plan to be doing, that's going to contribute to your life. And I can think of nothing else that your dad would want you to be doing right now than what you are doing. So, although you miss being here, what you're doing is pleasing him. There are three things that I think of that come out of my own tradition that really typify Joe Eggleston. First of all, I was his priest and friend, and he was my parishioner and friend. And he did me the great courtesy by entrusting me with so much of what was going on in his life in these last 8 years. We sat one late afternoon as he described to me with the clinical detail that many of you have described, his condition. And as you all know, Joe could talk. All you had to do was to get him started on almost any subject and sit back and be his student. And it was a delightful experience of learning. And I learned a great deal about his condition, and fared more than I will ever absorb or understand. But one of the things that comes out of my tradition that I think of in terms of Joe is the phrase, an inquiring and discerning heart. I want to double back to that, but I want to tell you what the other two are. The courage to will and to persevere, and the third one is the gift of joy and wonder. Joe had all three, and those three nice little phrases which can trip so easily from our lips, he translated into human reality. An inquiring and discerning heart. Joe not only had an amazing catalog of facts
and a wonderful encyclopedic knowledge of so many things, not just in the field of medicine. Yes, football. Yes, basketball. Almost anything. But it was far more for him than simply an accumulation of knowledge, because he could take knowledge and facts and see in them patterns, whereas other people might see only a collection of pieces. And so not only did he have great intellect, but he also had an intuitive wisdom. And out of that came the tapestry of so much that is the legacy, not only in the field of medicine, but in the field of being his friend. With an inquiring and discerning heart and mind, he also had the courage to will and to persevere. Now, Joe did not like to have people tell him he was courageous and brave. He denied that. And for someone like Joe, courage is what is extraordinary. For him, what he was doing was quite ordinary. And I think you and I would agree that we find the extraordinary to be courageous. And we saw that in Joe, but Joe didn't see it in Joe. He was doing what was perfectly natural for him to be doing. And in that process, which we would identify as his courage, he taught us not only how to live, but if we would let him, he taught us how to die. In the last few days of his life, as I was leaving the room, he turned to me and he said, "You know, I'm not afraid of being dead." Notice he didn't say dying or death. I'm not afraid of being dead. Because for Joe, beyond death was not annihilation. He was a person where, when he came to the edge of what one could know, there was not a void beyond that. There was not a vacuum. For him, there was a faith. And the faith for him was the assurance of things not seen, but believed. He was not afraid of being dead. The thing he didn't want to have happen was to be a burden on those he loved, particularly Sylvia and his cherished girls. But he did have that courage to will and to persevere. And then thirdly, the gift of joy and wonder. People have remarked about his humor. He had that. It was a humor that from some people might have a bite to it. And yes, indeed, it could have a bite. But it also had a wonderful invitation to enjoy with him some fresh insight, some sparkling new way to look at something in a new way. I've heard the story, although I didn't experience it. Larry, I think you told me, with somebody in the family, a youngster who was given, maybe Joe gave it to him, a small toy, tractor, truck, something of that nature. And there was Joe down on his hands and knees, not only showing the child how the tractor worked, or the truck, or whatever it was, but why it did. That was that wonderful combination of his great intellect and his great understanding and his caring about the human being, the gift of joy and wonder in all of God's works, particularly in his family, in you, his friends, his colleagues, his students, his superiors, if indeed there are any. And I thank God for the life of Joe Eggleston. My life has been enriched by his being my friend and my being his, and yours has too. And I'm honored to be part of this tribute to a great man. Thank you, Sylvia.
Let us pray. O God, by all your dealings with us, be they joy or pain, light or darkness, let us be drawn to you. Keep us from judging your intervention in our lives simply because it makes us happy or sad. but rather may all that comes to us bring us closer to you. Knowing that you are ever present with us makes us confident that even in times of discouragement, you are still caring about us. In every darkness, you are still enlightening us. In every death, you are giving us life. Eternal rest grant unto Joseph, O God, and may his soul, through your great mercy, rest in eternal peace. And grant unto us a taste of that peace that Joseph has inherited for all eternity. Amen.
I'd like to extend thanks to the participants and to all of you for coming. There will be, as announced, a reception in the doctor's dining room immediately.